Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar. We are delighted to have Professor Tatia Granger with us. The topic is Behavioral Responses to Conflict, Recognizing the Productive and Destructive and the Impact for Success. Before joining the faculty at the Raymond A. Mason School of Business, Dr. Granger served as the University Ombuds at the College of William & Mary. In that role, she sought to support more open and effective communication between employees and the college. Dr. Granger brings extensive experience in higher education, including serving as the Vice President for Enrollment Services at Bennett College for Women, Chief of Staff for the Vice President for Financial Services at Duke University, Assistant Dean for Undergraduate Admissions at the University of Virginia, and Director for the Center of Multicultural Studies at James Madison University. We are delighted to add to that impressive list. Tatia Granger is now a clinical associate professor in organizational behavior at the Mason School of Business at the College of William & Mary. She teaches both undergraduate and MBA students. Dr. Granger received her Ph.D. in Higher Education Administration from the University of Virginia. And before I hand it over to you, I want to thank, of course, as always, Karen Connor, who is in the background making this all possible, and remind you, as I always do, that these webinars are brought to you as part of our promise to provide you as alumni opportunities for ongoing learning, and no matter where we find you living and addressed. So with that, I will hand it over to Tatia. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eliza. I appreciate tremendously the invitation to be here today and to join virtually with all of our alumni, wherever you may be. As you heard in the introduction, we're going to spend some time today talking about behavioral responses to conflict. And I am particularly interested in this topic as a result of having spent 10 years in the role of an Ombuds, which is one that is intimately involved with conflict, and more specifically, how to move people beyond conflict. And so as a part of my growth in that role, I really looked for ways to help my visitors move beyond the issue and towards some type of resolution. And this is really a compilation of where I landed. So I think I'm gonna get myself started here. I would like to invite the audience out there to participate in a poll. So hopefully you see this royal court before you, and I'm still in the space of the recent royal wedding, so I thought it would be appropriate for us to not only hold on to that, but also use it as a means of introducing this topic. So I'd like for you to think about who you are in the royal court of conflict. Do you see yourself as the king or queen of confrontation, or the prince and princess or princess of passive aggression, or the duke or duchess of don't act? So we'll give a few seconds here to tally a few of these votes and see where folks land. This is in here. I'm going to give you a chance to see where you are. Back and forth. We're kind of even. We're a little skewed. Okay. I'm not sure at what point we'll cut you off. So if you haven't made a choice, I would say do that in the next few seconds. Okay, maybe we'll end the poll. Okay, so we can still see our lovely court. We can also see where you feel like you are. According to the results, about 50% of you are not unbelievably so in the don't act space. So you're falling in the Duke and Duchess category, and I'm not sure if that's just about not acting or if that's just, again, being connected to our recent royal wedding. So because we have about 50% of you in the don't act space, and can we scoot that over so I can see the results a little? I guess I can do that myself. There they are. And about another third in the passive aggression space, and then just about a quarter or about 12% in the king and queen of confrontation. this is good, and quite frankly, this is really where I expected you to be. Most people, when it comes to the idea of conflict, are much more comfortable in a space that takes them away from it. And so we're not trying to act in any way. So from here, we want to spend some time talking about what does that mean. So if you find yourself in the don't act space, what are the implications for that, for the conflict, but more importantly for you as a colleague, as a classmate, as a leader, as a manager, as an employee? And so that's really the role of our conversation today. So once I get all my technology moving, let me click. Oh, great. So, we want to cover a couple of major topics today. The first of which is using this information to help you understand kind of who you are and what your tendencies are in terms of responses, behavioral responses in conflict. The other piece is just to remind you that once you recognize that about yourself, you have choices. And with choices come responsibility, but also comes power. And once you recognize what those behavioral responses have the potential to do in the space of conflict, then my hope is that you will make some choices that will take you down the constructive path rather than the destructive path. And so with that, let's actually look at the path of conflict and what it entails and what our options are. So what you see before you is some information that I tend to use pretty frequently, as I mentioned, in my Ombuds role, and now that I'm teaching, and in particular in spaces where I'm talking about leadership and organizational behavior, it's really important that everybody understand what the repercussions of behavior around conflict are. And so one of the tools that I've used over time is one called the Conflict Dynamics Profile. And one of the first things it does is it helps us outline what the path of conflict looks like. And so it's really helpful for folks to understand that conflict is, quite frankly, inevitable, but it is also something that we have an ability to manage, if you will. And so part of that is recognizing where it comes from, how it starts, and then what our optional responses are. So if you're looking at this particular image, what you hopefully recognize is that you have a choice for your path. You can choose the constructive path, which will help you de-escalate conflict, hopefully. Or you can choose the destructive path, which obviously is not going to work in the space of de-escalating, but rather it's really going to add fuel to the fire. And so I want to help you understand just in the moment how you might be able to make some quick assessments about which path to take. So in each situation, you should think of conflict as a prompt. And when you think of conflict as a prompt, recognize that you have full authority to decide how you're going to respond to that prompt. If you, in fact, think about the conflict as a process, a project, or a problem to solve, then you're much more likely to err on the side of the constructive path. Because what we tend to do with problems is we want to fix those, we want to solve those. And in the way that we engage with problems, that tends to be cognitive. And when we focus on something in a more cognitive way, we minimize our emotional engagement, which allows us to connect with our more rational self. And so we are focused on the problem itself. We're thinking creatively about how to solve the problem. We are not as anchored down by our emotions, but we are in fact being creative and engaging on a very productive or constructive space. On the other hand, if we think about the prompt and we think about the source of the prompt, which is typically a person, then that almost takes us inevitably towards the destructive responses. And the reason is, as humans and as emotional beings, we tend to associate that prompt with the person. And so in the way that we're not able to immediately separate the person from the problem, and more likely are focusing on the person, then we are sometimes hijacked by our emotions. We tend not to think as or focus on the issue as cognitively. We also are much more likely to be thinking about the outcome in the way that we tend to be focused on the individual. And so those are some key primary indicators in terms of which path you're more likely to take. Keeping in mind both are options, and sometimes both might be appropriate. One or the other might be appropriate. I'm not suggesting that there won't be times when you'll make some destructive choices or use some destructive responses, but there's still a way to pull the ultimate outcome, which is some type of resolution for you from that. So again, just wanting to make you familiar with and comfortable with the path as I see it. So getting specifically into the behaviors. So one of the things in one of the areas that we really like to focus on, particularly in organizational behavior, is, as the name suggests, the behaviors that contribute to effective and productive output. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, in conflict, you have some choices. Not only do you have some choices between constructive and destructive behavioral responses, but within those two dimensions, there's also this notion of active and passive behavior. So when we go back to our royal court of conflict, and we're thinking about the fact that 50% of you chose don't act, that really points to, in most situations, passive behavior. But it's important to recognize that passive behavior, which is sometimes non-behavior, also has an impact on conflict. And so wanting to recognize that is just as important. So we're going to get into the actual behaviors and what they look like and how they influence the situation. This graphic, I wanted to just kind of quickly lead us into our behaviors, because what I feel like this represents is our almost innate reaction to associate our response, our behavioral response, to the person. And as you see here, it just says, I have just the response for you. Again, this almost inevitably takes us down that destructive conflict behavior path, because we're thinking about the other person. We're not thinking about the potential project and the success for the organization or for either one of us as individuals if we stay focused on the problem at hand. So what are our other options when we're not going to focus on the person? Here we go. And this is where we're going to spend a lot of time. So what you see before you is a grid that outlines this notion of constructive behavior and destructive behavior. And then within those, you're also noticing that there's a dimension that is active and one that is passive. And so with that, what you see and what we're going to explore is what these behaviors really look like in terms of what we see each other doing in the workplace. And that's significant because we're not always as keenly aware of what kind of behavioral messages we're sending. And once we start to think about that more intentionally, we can make some choices about what that behavior, how to change that behavior rather, and whether that's the appropriate behavioral message to send to someone else. And so a lot of this is going to be anchored in heightening your self-awareness about where you are, what kind of messages you're sending, and how you might be able to monitor and or modify those behaviors. So let's focus on the constructive side right now. And we're going to start with the active category. I want you to really have a sense, I'm going to fiddle through my notes here for a second. I want you to really have a sense of recognizing, again, what these look like in terms of behavioral responses, because to the extent that you can start to visualize what the behavior looks like, you can think for yourself, is that something that I do, or is that something that I see in my workspace, in my personal space? And once you start to think about these behaviors, you can start to think about where those behaviors are likely to take you. So let's start with perspective taking. One of my favorites because it suggests a little bit of, not a little bit, but some reflective pursuits. It's also where I think this notion of empathetic connection is involved because as you see here, it's really just about being willing to get into the other person's space. So I like to challenge my students around perspective thinking to take the position of expanding their sphere of consideration, if you will. So how can I think a little bit more broadly about this situation or this circumstance in a way that might allow me to get to a more positive outcome or at least a solution. Um, and so what that actually looks like is brainstorming, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in the next one. But it's being willing to brainstorm from the other person's perspective. So stepping into the other person's shoes, if you will. It's questioning, asking the other person or folks questions, but from a perspective of wanting to understand where they are, and therefore broadening again your sphere of consideration. Once you're there, then you set yourself up to move down that constructive path. The next step is about creating solutions. And so with this particular behavior, what you will see and what that tends to look like is this notion of brainstorming. So this is idea generation on overload if you're doing it correctly. It's not about being stuck in the moment. It's not about valuing and adding or putting value on each and every idea that's put on the table or brought to the conversation. It's really about generating as many ideas as possible and being willing to put them all out there so that you have a lot to work from once you do sit down and you start to sort through them as you move towards a solution. And as long as you're willing to be in a space where you're more interested in generating volume and quantity of ideas and not worried about who gets the credit for the idea, that's another indicator that you're really operating in this creating solutions space. So think about that. More, multiple, moving on. That's really what this should engage you. It also, if I had to add another M, I would say not mine. And that gets back at this notion of not wanting to take credit for whatever does come to the table. We can take credit later. Now, the final two active, constructive responses that I'd like to call your attention to are expressing emotions and reaching out. So now, with expressing emotions, we're at a space where it's really important that you be able to be comfortable expressing to someone else in the space how you are feeling in the moment of conflict. And the reason that this is a constructive, active behavior is because if you are able to share with those around you where you are emotionally, it often changes the course of the conversation, of the process to move in conflict. It also allows you to release what you're feeling and the impact that being able to move beyond the emotion at that particular time has on the process, the conflict situation. And so that's where expressing emotions comes into play. Some of you might be asking, is it really appropriate that I express emotions? How much is too much? And can I get labeled as being too emotional? And yes, yes, and yes. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that what you're doing here is you're expressing the emotions that are at play for the conflict. Yes, I see we might have a question or something.
Professor Granger, I think this is one that might go back to your day as the Ombuds.
Sure.
It's coming in from Chris Gottfried. I agree that one should definitely be addressing between oneself and the other party directly using such tools, but are there instances or circumstances where bringing in another person to help facilitate or sort of mediate or buffer?
Oh, Chris.
And then he goes on to say, especially if there's a time, or she, I'm sorry, Chris, especially is there time to incorporate help?
Oh, Chris, thank you for that, bringing that up. And you're absolutely on point. There are some situations and some specific timelines where it almost seems obvious that I'll just use two, the two individuals are at an impasse, if you will. And so, in fact, it is appropriate to bring in external individuals, a neutral party, a neutral third party, if you will, and someone who can help move the process along by not only helping focus on the project, the problem, the issue, but also help pay attention to some of the behavioral cues. And that's another reason that recognizing what those behavioral cues are, what they look like, and what direction they're sending you in is very helpful. So yes, you're absolutely onto something here. At some point, you may feel that it's appropriate to bring in, like I said, a third party neutral to help not only with the issue itself, but also to help process the larger connection between the individuals in terms of behavioral cues and language. And we're going to talk about language pretty shortly. The last active constructive behavior that I want to just throw out there for you to give you some insight about and have you think about, have I seen this? Do I do this? Is this notion of reaching out. This is really the one that is about extending the olive branch, if you will. It's about willing to take an emotional risk because sometimes taking the first step in conflict really is much more of an emotional risk than anything else. It's also about this willingness to be vulnerable. This is going to allow others in the space to see exactly where you are, and it signals your intentions. And so this is one of the ones that I think takes a lot of courage, and you really have to be willing, like I said, to put yourself in a vulnerable position to really extend that olive branch. And sometimes it can be as simple as saying to the person, and Chris, I'll use your example, we seem to be stuck. What I'd like to do is have us try to address this in a different way, from a different perspective. Now, what that might entail is bringing in a third party. But let's be willing to consider that maybe we haven't approached this in the best way possible. And that's really what reaching out looks like. So, so these are our four active behavioral responses. What I want to do now is give you an opportunity to chime in again. And these graphics kind of represent those four, and I'll remind you, the eyeglasses are all about perspective taking because it's kind of seeing what other people see. And then the light bulb is about creating solutions. And then we have expressing some emotions with all of those emojis, and then reaching out, which I just covered. So I'd like for you to share with me which of these constructive, active behaviors either you feel like you demonstrate yourself or you most often witness in your space. And when I say space, I mean you can associate that to workspace, personal space, whatever is the most appropriate for you to be able to address this question. This is great, seeing all of the responses coming in. Again, perspective taking, being willing to put yourself in the other person's shoes, creating solutions, that whole notion of brainstorming, and not being so concerned about who gets credit for the ideas at the time, expressing emotions that are appropriate to trying to advance the conversation and move the conflict situation forward, and then reaching out in terms of taking that emotional risk sometime and making yourself the first person who looks for a different way to approach the situation, particularly when you're at an impasse. Anybody else? And some of you might, I don't know if we give you an opportunity to pick more than one. If you can just focus, I'd like for you to just focus on what you feel like is primary. Okay, perfect. That's good. Primary responses are good responses. Okay, so let's almost a couple more seconds.
While you're waiting, we just got a question in from Valerie Williams. Hello, Val. When you're discussing these responses, are they employed over a short period of time, or is this something that might be more sustained period of time?
Thank you, Val, for that question. And absolutely, it could be a combination, but your goal should be sustained behavior, particularly in this space, in the constructive, active behaviors, because those are the ones that are more likely to de-escalate the conflict. And so, to the extent possible, you want to figure out which one of these you're most comfortable with and make that your go-to approach. Because, quite frankly, practice over time allows you to get better at this. And then you recognize that if that's where you're comfortable, that's where you're going to go. And again, these are going to take us to de-escalation around conflict rather than escalation. So, okay, so we'll close out our poll at this point. We're kind of going back and forth, but it looks like what you're most likely seeing in your space is creating solutions and then perspective taking. And that is, again, not uncommon from other research feedback, because we are likely to be willing, or at least we think we're willing, to look into the space of someone else. And then that creating solutions piece allows us some flexibility. Keeping in mind, when we get to the expressing emotions and the reaching out, those require, as I said, a little bit more personal courage and a little bit more personal risk, emotional risk. So we tend not to necessarily see as much of that, but we can definitely get there. And if that is the behavior that feels comfortable for you, then I encourage you to continue to work and strengthen that. So I want to also let you see what your options are in the constructive but passive space, because sometimes no response to conflict still contributes to the outcome of conflict. And that's where this notion of passive responses or behavior really comes into play. And so here we have 3 areas for you to think about. Do I do this? Do I see this? What are the benefits? If I can't be active, if I can't demonstrate one of those active behaviors, maybe there's something in this space that allows me to at least contribute to the de-escalation of conflict, but not putting myself out there in more of an overt way. So reflective thinking, simply what it says, it gives you an opportunity to think about the context of the situation, try to plan your response. All of this passive piece is really happening in your head. And so the reflective thinking is your opportunity to dissect the internally. And as you're thinking about it, that means you're adding more cognitive energy to it. And that's really what we want to have happen. In terms of delay responding, I like to encourage folks to think about this one as a precursor to getting to one of those active behaviors. And the reason is delay responding does not mean you won't ever respond. What it really means is you are assessing the best time to respond. And that can sometimes really make the difference in terms of the situation. Sometimes you recognize that the immediate response is not the best timing. You may find that the immediate environment is more emotionally charged. And so to the degree that we can let the emotions subside and then come back and respond, that might put us in a better situation. And then finally, adapting. Adapting is all about being flexible and being willing to recognize that the ideas and the concepts that you came to the table with may not be the best suited for the outcome. And so being willing to be flexible about the course of action is exceptionally helpful. This does not mean you are giving in all the time, and we'll talk about that and what that looks like on the flip side. But again, it does mean that you are flexible enough to acknowledge that sometimes recognizing that another option that has been put on the table is the best one. And so letting go of what you came to the table with seems to be the appropriate pursuit right now. So those are our passive constructive behaviors. Are there any questions about those that we want to?
There's a comment
Okay.
from Gray Oliver. Key, so it's a statement, key enabler of creating solutions is the feeling of trust and acceptance. Tough to get this if people aren't sharing freely. So I guess being open and honest and being willing to engage in these conversations rather than just shutting down.
Absolutely. Another really good point to bring out, and that really takes us back to that notion of this requiring courage. You know, conflict is not easy. It is inevitable. But at its core, what I appreciate, and I can say this after having spent long periods of time working with folks to get beyond conflict, um, the courage that you have to invoke to get beyond the situation that is challenging you, inevitably it grows you. And that's probably not grammatically correct, but that's what it does. It creates some personal growth and strength. And a lot of that is internal, and a lot of that requires you to take some of those risks we talked about a few minutes ago. So you're right, it's not easy. And if you're in an environment where you feel like the trust factor is questionable, then you have to make decisions for yourself. Maybe delay responding is a good one. So maybe the active constructive behaviors may not be appropriate yet for your space. You may want to think about which of the passive constructive behaviors might help me navigate this space and get to a place where I feel more comfortable and I've mustered up more courage to try and advance this again in a positive direction, not contributing to the potential for escalating the conflict. So thank you. We're going to move on to the destructive side because we also want to give you some insight there. You might be seeing some of this, or this might seem personally relatable to you. So on the destructive side, again, in the active space, and these are things that, again, sometimes we might feel like this is where we have to be. This, to the question that was asked earlier about whether this should be something short-term or more sustainable, this should definitely be short-term. This should be something that if you have to engage in one of these behaviors, you feel like this is strategic. I will say that more than likely, if this kind of behavior happens, if you can have it happen as a one-off, it's probably a situation where you feel like you are engaging in survival mode. If this behavior becomes more persistent and long-term, then I would really encourage you to work with someone, maybe a behavioral coach, first to help yourself recognize when this is likely to happen, and then how to cut it off at the pass if you can, but then if not immediately being able to cut it off, at least being able to recognize it and minimize the impact of it. So there might be degrees of this as we go through that you'll feel like you recognize. So first, winning at all cost. One of the things I'll say about this is often one of the behaviors that spikes pretty high among my undergraduate students. I tend to have a number of athletes in my classes, and their sense of competition really spills over into a lot of their behaviors. And so to the extent that they are beginning to understand that there's a time and a space for that notion of competition, and what that looks like beyond the playing field or the court. Behaviorally speaking, what this looks like is a very engaged, kind of rigorous conversation, high emotions at play, dominance for self in the conversation, very little, as it says here, very little concern for the other's position, not being willing to concede, even to give the person an opportunity to talk. That really suggests that this person feels like their idea is the best idea, and they're probably not going to be willing to give in, as you know, and be adaptable, as we talked about on the constructive passive side. And so you want to just pay attention to that. You also want to recognize that to a certain extent, that can be attributed to a certain level of passion in that space for that person. the more engaged the person feels like they are with the outcome, the more passionate they are likely to be, and then therefore display some of these behaviors. But you've also got to be aware of the environment that you're in and whether this is going to be appropriate. The next one, displaying anger. It is what it is, and you know it when you see it. And that's really about the best way to describe this one. It's going to be, the yelling, the loud voice. It could be profane language, appropriate or not appropriate, mostly not appropriate. Or it could be kind of very, physical engagement, like, banging on a desk or slamming doors, knocking things over. Unfortunately, I've heard a little bit of all of that. Like I said, displaying anger is pretty obvious, and you know it when you see it. So my advice there would be to minimize that for yourself and for those around you. Demeaning others and retaliating are two final active behaviors. Demeaning others is really, unfortunately, it has become a lot more prominent in the workplace. And it's really a precursor to what we are beginning to see as workplace bullying, quite frankly. What it really means is folks are using or taking opportunities to make others feel less than in the workspace. And that can happen because I discount you in a physical way. So if we are in a meeting with a team and I turn my back to you when you're talking, that is an active, destructive behavior that suggests that I am not giving you the respect that you deserve in the moment. You have the floor, you're speaking, and I'm either using my physical frame and space to cut you off or minimize your opportunity within the space, or it might be language. Some other ways to recognize that: it could be rolling of the eyes or sighing. On the language side, it could be excessive sarcasm. It could be the use of microaggressions, which are either, again, it could be commentary or behavioral positioning that suggests over and over that you don't have time for me. I don't really want to give you more credit or more space in this room than I need to. And people start to pick up on things like that. Maybe I even now, with cell phones and other devices that we are sometimes connected to in meetings, if you have been paying attention throughout the meeting and then when I decide to make a comment, you immediately go to your phone, or every time I make a comment, you immediately go to your phone, I might start to pick up on that, or our colleagues might start to pick up on that. That's what demeaning others looks like in terms of behavior. In terms of retaliating, this is another active means of excluding. And so I will say for these two, my students are often thinking, I don't do that. I'm better than that. I'm a bigger person, and I don't engage in those kinds of behaviors. But once you start to make some of the nuances of the behavior prominent and clear and understandable, then people really have to take a step back and say, well, actually, I do that sometimes. And maybe I should think twice about doing that over and over and over, particularly with the same person. You could be, and you probably are, sending messages. So in terms of retaliating, it could be something you're looking to get even because you feel like you've been slighted. And actively, what that looks like is excluding people from email responses or the start of an email. If you know that your colleague needs to be involved in this conversation and you intentionally leave that person off of the email exchange, that's a form of retaliation because it could also be demeaning others. It could be a microaggression, but it's a way in which you behave to create exclusion for someone else because you're trying to make a point about getting even. So those are some of the behaviors. You might also wait. The meeting is over and you wait for that one person to leave before you invite everybody else to lunch. So that's a little bit of creating, again, an exclusionary opportunity. You left that person out. Well, oh, oh, that's right. Well, she had already left the room when I extended the invitation to go to lunch. But did you go down the hall to catch her and say, oh, by the way, we're all going to lunch together? You have to think about the behavior and how it comes across. So those are the passive or the active ones. They're easy to recognize. People do pay attention to them. You should pay attention to them. And so now I'd like to know what you see or what you might do. And because you're at a distance and nobody knows who you are, be very honest in this particular poll in terms of what you're seeing. So this is our last poll, and this gives you an opportunity to talk about these destructive active responses. Are you trying to win at all costs? Are you someone who's displaying anger, or you're seeing that? Do you recognize the demeaning others syndrome, or is retaliation prominent in your space?
While people are filling that out, I
Yes.
just wonder, this isn't a question, but it's kind of amusing. Catherine Vest has written in to say, this is so helpful for my teenage son. Unfortunately, reasoning is not an option.
Catherine, I can appreciate that. I have teenagers at home myself, and what I often communicate to my visitors in my professional space is my life would be so much better if this worked at home. So I think primarily one of the main reasons that we maybe have to try a little harder and it is much more challenging is because our home space is consistently emotionally charged and everything is personal. It's not always about getting to the best outcome for the problem. There are lots of people engaged. So the best I can say is good luck with that. Okay, so let's see where we are. Don't be shy about responding. As I see where we're coming in, it looks like demeaning others is far out in front. And first of all, I'm grateful for your frank responses and your honesty here. About 50%, we have gotten to 50% of you either recognizing that in others or at least being willing to acknowledge that you might be caught up in a little bit of that yourself. And quite frankly, we all do it sometimes. So that's okay. The key, though, is knowing that we do it and either wanting not to do it, wanting to minimize it, or at least being willing to recognize what that contributes in the space of conflict. If we're genuinely trying to get beyond the conflict, then we have to be willing to step up and say, I got to get out of that particular behavior. So we'll cut the poll off at this point. Thank you for your responses there. What I would say about, this notion of demeaning others, and again, this was the one I said, remember, that is much more prominent in our workspace. It's the precursor to the workplace bullying. It really is devoid of respect for others and consideration for others. And this is that's an active response. So what I would say in terms of strategy, how to get beyond that, is to think about the ways in which some of those active constructive responses might be able to really refute this kind of behavior. And also what you might be able to do in terms of offering or getting for yourself feedback. If this is what you're witnessing, a lot of times we don't realize that that's how the behavior is interpreted, and that's what allows us to maintain and continue contributing behaviorally in that way until we start to get some feedback that suggests the outcomes and we recognize what our other options are. So I don't want us to miss out on our passive responses, so let's do that. So on the destructive side, click it, there we go. We have some passive responses. Avoiding, and that's where we all kind of clicked in as Duke and Duchess of Don't Act. And avoiding is like earlier when we said displaying anger is what it is. Avoiding is pretty much is what it is. You are going the other way, you're running the other way, you're not interested in the conflict, you just don't want to get caught up in it. But what you need to recognize is that this behavior sends cues to your colleagues. And essentially the primary one is it makes you really come across as distant or aloof. And sometimes that can be interpreted as not engaged, not committed. And if this is at work, that's a problem. And so what I would say here is In as much as conflict is not going to be comfortable for any of us, it's also something we're going to have to figure out how to move beyond. And we can do it with baby steps, but we've got to get beyond the avoiding. Yielding is giving in to the other person, acquiescing. We sometimes feel like that makes us come across as weak rather than agreeable, but what it often does in terms of contributing to the negative is it keeps your thoughts and ideas from the table of possibilities. And sometimes your thoughts and ideas are the ones that are going to advance the conflict. So you want to make sure that you're sharing that with others. Hiding emotions, which is the flip side of expressing emotions. And this is destructive because the more that you hold in your emotions, the less able you are to really be willing to connect with others, and there may be some internal conflict building up as a result of that too. And so you do not want to hide how you feel, particularly not excessively. Not being honest about the emotional impact of the conflict is not where we want to be. We want to give people some insight to what this conflict is doing in our space. And then self-criticizing is the final one. This is one that if you are in a professional space and you are doing a good job, again, this is one where my students tend to spike high because they're such overachievers and they're very cognizant of the end game. And so self-criticizing is having this conversation in your head over and over, this self-badgering about your decisions and your actions. Sometimes you got to just let that go and be willing to move on. You yourself. This is not about other people. This is about you not allowing yourself to move on. So you want to make sure that you're giving yourself the space to let go of even decisions or behaviors that you feel like may not be good ones. You're only going to move into a better space around those if you let those go and just count them as lessons learned. So those are our passive behaviors on the destructive side. We've now looked at kind of what it means to walk the walk. Hopefully you have a little bit of insight, some ways in which you're going to pay greater attention to your own behavior as well as those around you. What I want to do now is shift gears, and because conflict, we tend to think about the conversations we are having. I also want to give you just a little bit of information to consider around communication, because a lot of times that's where we think the core of the issue is. And I do believe that the conversation, the communication, the process of communication goes a long way to moving us beyond the conflict. But I also feel like those behavioral cues say a lot. And sometimes in the essence of actions speaking louder than words, sometimes you only have actions to pay attention to. Now you have lots of actions to pay attention to. So I hope you'll find those helpful. On the communication side, one of the messages that I have also picked up over the years and that has really helped transform my conversations with my visitors is thinking of language differently. And so typically we think of language as a way to describe the situation and recount the situation. And so that automatically puts us in a descriptive and passive space. And if you think about the conversation we just had around behavior, it almost pulls you into the passive types of behavior. You want to be in an active space with respect to conflict, or because you want to determine what's going to happen around the conflict, not have the conflict drive everything else. And so shifting the way you think about language is also helpful. So I want you from this point on to think about language as more descriptive, creative, less descriptive, but more creative and generative. And what I mean by that, we're going to be out with the old, in with the new. What I mean by that is think about the way in which using generative and creative language can change these particular elements here. Relationships. One of the things I often say is if you want to change your relationship, change your conversation. When you pay attention to the way in which you connect with others, the language that you use, the context that you call upon, the moods that you create, and all of those things you see there, then you can slowly begin to change the relationships that you have with other people, particularly if you are leaning in the generative and creative space and not dwelling in the descriptive and the passive space. Public identity is also another space where you get to have your public identity start with how you want it to be perceived. So you have to first say who you are as a professional, as a leader, and you have to be consistent in that. And then the more you share that with others, the more likely others are to start to see you that way. Now, it is important that your behavior back up your language. So we've already talked about behavioral cues, and now it's a matter of setting yourself up through the language that you use. Language is action, to speak is to act. What that means is think about the conflict as a point that you want to get beyond. If you're able to articulate and communicate where you want to be with respect to the conflict, the issue, the problem, the project, if you can put that out there first, then you're giving yourself a place to work toward. Some key speech acts that I want you to keep in mind: assertions, assessments, and declarations. Assertions are verifiable. They are verifiable by someone else. And so if someone else can say it's true or false, then in other words, is it measurable? Can I point to it? Can I say that that's the case? That's an assertion. And there's a place for assertions. Assertions are good when it's almost fact-based. You're not going to be impacted by mood or emotion. It's really the descriptive. It also sometimes takes us to the past. Assessments are good for pulling in judgment, for better or for worse, but also you start to recognize where a person is by listening to their assessments, because you can pick up on mood and emotion, and to the extent that the assessments might give some direction about where to go in terms of language, then that's something else that you can really pick up on and determine how to use going forward. Declarations are the most future-focused statements that you can make. Their context is all about where we want to go. And so to the extent that you want to move beyond the conflict, make some kind of declaration. This situation is not going to stifle us. We are going to move beyond this. That is a declaration. And that's the kind of language you want to use in conflict situations. So I share this picture because as you look at it, there are some assertions versus assessments. Assertions might be things like, there are 3 people at the table that's closest to our viewing perspective. If I said there are 4 people at the table closest to our viewing perspective, that can still be verified. It can be true or it can be false. And an assessment might be that that's a group of colleagues having lunch together. Another assessment might be that's a family having dinner together. So depending on how you are interpreting what you see and then communicating it gives lots of value to the conversation and the direction that the conversation is going in. And that's really what I want you to think about. So as I wrap up and give you an opportunity for questions, and I can go back to that image in a few minutes, but I want you to think about some personal practice, if you will. I'm a firm believer that practice makes better. Not perfect, but better. And if you approach any effort with a get up and go after it every day kind of attitude, I think you're only likely to see improvement. If you find yourself thinking that there's a particular place that you want to get, as in perfection, then you might set yourself up for getting to that space and then ceasing to continue to practice. So my encouragement for you is keep practicing. And your assignments, if you choose to accept them, are to think about the behaviors that you are demonstrating when an uncomfortable situation arrives. You now have a number of behaviors that you can assess for yourself. You can try to figure out, Am I in the constructive active space? Am I in the constructive passive space? Am I in the destructive active space? Am I in the destructive passive space? And to the extent that you can start to give yourself some feedback about where you find yourself, then you can start to make some intentional and strategic changes about the behaviors that you are demonstrating. At the same time, it's really helpful to listen in conflict. And that is listening to yourself as much as it is about listening to other people. Where are you hearing assessments versus assertions? What kind of declarations are you hearing from folks that can give an indication about where that person wants to go in conflict? If you hear things like, I don't see that we can move beyond this, that's a declaration too. Now, it's not a positive one, but it certainly gives you some indication about where that person is positioning him or herself around this notion of conflict. The more attuned you become to these kinds of key cues in your personal or professional space, then I would say the more effective you become around choosing the appropriate path to move forward. So we have just a few minutes. I'm happy to take any questions or comments that you have.
There is a comment that's come in from Talbot Kennedy, and it's just so many layers. I've been reading this and thinking about it. Regarding other perspectives, my father said the best advice he received as an attorney was to know the other side's case as well, or better than your own, and that way you can form the best legal argument. But I as I'm reading that, thinking just really understand what is the empathy.
Right.
Basically empathy.
Oh, absolutely. And that, again, it takes courage to be willing to expand your sphere of consideration. You have to be interested enough to get into that other person's case or situation to really make that happen. But it's a great place to be with respect to conflict if, in fact, your goal is to get beyond this particular situation.
I think one of the conversations we have a lot in our office, too, is each one of us comes at something with oftentimes a different goal.
Right.
But to understand what goal people have so you can support one another rather than challenge one another.
Right. And the key there that sometimes we overlook, we automatically assume that the outcome of conflict is going to be negative, when in fact, when we process it appropriately, the outcome of any type of conflict situation can be better than where we started. Mm-hmm. And that's a positive. That's constructive all day long. And so when you have multiple perspectives, goals, values, opinions, all coming into play, to the extent that we're able to be willing to, again, kind of step back, take the perspective, see what we can pull from each of those to make the best of the eventual outcome, I think that's when we've really done what we need to do in the conflict space.
Well, I've noticed that here it is. He's just writing to say thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you, Harold. Professor Granger, I too would like to thank you. Again, this is Eliza Parrish. I don't think I introduced myself in the beginning, which I want to do. But thank you also very much for attending and participating, and thank you for sharing your research and knowledge with our attendees. And we hope all to, air quotes, see you again soon for the next webinar. Thank you so much for participating, audience, and thank you, Karen and Kelly, for helping in the background.
Thank you very much. It was my